Welcome to episode 5 of Rise of a Nation South America. This episode is on Ecuador.
Okay, let's unpack this stack of sources we have here, all about the history of Ecuador. We've got articles, research papers, and some of our own notes covering centuries of this country's journey.
That's right. It's quite a history from Spanish colonization and the intense fight for independence through that ambitious but ultimately pretty short-lived project of Gran Colombia.
And we'll trace its long periods of political instability, which, our sources describe vividly, plus highlighting its significant border disputes with Peru, including some key wars and treaties.
So our mission for this deep dive is really to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the things that really help you understand why Ecuador's independent history has often been described as, well, tumultuous, marked by just so many constitutions, coups, and conflicts.
Exactly. Think of this as your shortcut to getting a handle on the historical threads that explain Ecuador's journey towards stability, or, sometimes the lack of it, and how those geographical divisions you often see on a map created these deep political rifts that really shaped the nation.
Yeah, we're jumping into the story of a country that has consistently strived for stability, but always against this backdrop of significant internal divisions and external pressures, too.
Right. Let's dive in. So, jumping right into the Spanish colonial period, our sources tell us something really interesting. The territory that became much of present-day Ecuador, known then as the Real Audiencia de Quito. It wasn't primarily about gold or silver, was it? Unlike other parts of the Spanish Empire.
No, not really. The sources point out its wealth was mainly agricultural. And this had a huge social impact, like right from the start. Because of this focus on farming, the highland indigenous population ended up in forced labor, working on these big landed estates and in textile mills owned by the colonial elite.
Ah, okay. So immediately you see class and ethnicity getting deeply tangled up through that economic structure, that dynamic built on forced labor and a landowning elite. It left a long and difficult legacy of racism that definitely played a role in the country's later divisions and struggles, didn't it?
Absolutely. That early social structure laid some serious groundwork for future conflict. No question.
Now let's talk about the spark for independence. It wasn't just internal stuff bubbling up, right? External events played a big part too. Like Napoleon toppling the Spanish king in 1808. That must have sent shockwaves.
Oh, huge shockwaves. And surprisingly, Quito was right at the forefront of the response in the Americas. The sources tell us it was actually the first place where locals tried to claim autonomy after that imperial disruption. August 10th, 1809, the Criollo elite, that's Spanish folks born in the Americas, they signed a document declaring this.
A day they still celebrate as the first cry of independence. But like you said, the Spanish reaction was fast and harsh. That new regime lasted, barely 24 days? So that first try didn't really stick. What eventually tipped the scales for the independence side?
Well, what proved decisive was really external military power, specifically Simón Bolívar's troops marching down from the north.
Right. And a critical moment there was the Battle of Pichincha, May 24th, 1822. This battle, led by Antonio José de Sucre, one of Bolivar's main guys. It was fought near Quito, and it was decisive. That victory pretty much destroyed the remaining royalist forces and secured independence for the Real Audiencia de Quito.
Exactly. That was the key victory coming from the north. But it wasn't only a northern thing. Independence also sort of popped up from the south, particularly down in Guayaquil. A patriotic junta there, led by the poet José Joaquín de Olmedo, had already proclaimed independence back in October 1820.
Okay. And they even organized their own military unit, the División Protectora de Quito, specifically to march into the highlands and spread the movement. And the sources give us some fascinating specifics about how that Guayaquil uprising was planned, right? There was this crucial meeting, October 1st, 1820, called La Fragua de Vulcano, the Forge of Volcano.
Yeah, it wasn't just spontaneous. This is where key figures like José de Villamil, León de Febres Cordero, and Luis Urdaneta basically mapped out the whole uprising, including, strategic moves to grab specific military spots. So a very deliberate action from the coast.
Although the Guayaquil Patriots did face some early setbacks, like a defeat at the Battle of Huachi in November 1820, reinforcements were key, it sounds like. Aid arrived from Peru under Andrés de Santa Cruz Calahumana, which helped Sucre's campaign eventually turn the tide and get that final win at Pichincha. So independence was secured through a mix of northern and southern efforts with quite a bit of external help.
Precisely. And it was that whole context of liberation, especially with Bolivar's forces involved, that really set the stage for what happened next. After independence was locked down, Bolivar met José de San Martín at the Guayaquil Conference. And Bolivar basically persuaded both the local elite in Guayaquil and San Martín himself that the territory should join up with the liberated lands to the north.
So what was the upshot of that decision? Given how it was liberated and that push at the conference, the territory of the Real Audiencia de Quito decided to join Gran Colombia.
Yeah, this was Bolivar's big vision, this large republic including present-day Colombia, Venezuela, Panama, and Ecuador, which became known as the District of the South within this new setup.
But the sources are pretty clear. This union, officially the Republic of Colombia, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing, was it? Its whole existence was marked by this constant struggle.
Absolutely. There was this deep divide, between those who wanted a centralized government with a strong president like Bolivar himself and those who backed a decentralized federal system like Vice President Francisco de Paula Santander. These deep political differences plus regional tensions between the parts just caused massive instability the whole time Gran Colombia existed.
And external pressures and war dominated this period too. First, the territory was basically the front line in Bolivar's campaign to liberate Peru between 1822 and 1825.
And then, from 1828 to 1829, there was an actual armed struggle between Peru and Gran Colombia, specifically over where their border should be. So those border issues we're going to talk more about, they actually have roots way back here.
Interesting link. So when Bolivar's political clout started to fade, were those internal divisions just too much?
Pretty much. The internal cracks just became too wide to hold it all together. Ecuador declared it was leaving Gran Colombia on May 13, 1830, right after Bolivar stepped down from the presidency.
And the newly independent state didn't stick with the name Colombia. It went for Republic of the Equator.
Right, a name inspired by a text from a scientific mission back in 1748, one trying to measure the Earth's roundness. And the sources note, beyond keeping similar flag colors to modern Colombia and Venezuela, it didn't keep much from the Union. It was kind of starting fresh, but with those deep divisions already baked in.
So the new republic is born in 1830. What happens next? Our sources say the first 15 years were largely dominated by one guy, Juan José Flores, a Venezuelan who had been an officer in Bolivar's army.
Yes, and the sources suggest his main interest was, keeping himself in power, often using the military to do it. His focus on military spending, left over from the independence wars and even a campaign against Colombia, apparently left the state treasury totally empty.
And how did that era of Flores's dominance finally end?
Well, he tried to change the Constitution in 1843 to basically stay in power indefinitely. And that move triggered a massive liberal rebellion, the March Revolution, which eventually kicked him out.
And the period that followed, from 1843 to 1859, was reportedly one of the most turbulent. Why was that?
It was just marked by these really weak regimes, dominated by an elite minority. And crucially, this elite itself was deeply split, building on that historical class structure we mentioned earlier.
Ah, right, that division again. Tell us more about that split.
So you had the highland landowners, who were generally allied with the Catholic Church and formed the base of a conservative party. And then you had the coastal commercial interests, who were more into free trade, secularization, and they formed the core of the Liberal Party. These geographical and economic divides, rooted way back in the colonial era, deeply shaped Ecuador's politics all through the 19th century, often leading to, violent conflicts.
Wow, so the geography really did translate into political, even violent splits. This deep conflict was maybe best summed up by two really bitter opponents, wasn't it? Gabriel Garcia Moreno and Eloy Alfaro.
Exactly. Gabriel Garcia Moreno was this staunch conservative and authoritarian Catholic figure who dominated from 1861 to 1875.
Our sources say he did try to fight corruption and pushed for science and higher education, but he also limited citizenship only to Catholics. Pretty extreme. His dictatorial style led to his assassination in 1875 by liberal opponents, right?
That's right. And then on the other side, you had Eloy Alfaro, a radical, anti-clerical liberal leader from the coast. He led the Liberal Revolution of 1895 and was president for about 11 years, implementing major modernizing reforms.
Reforms like separating church and state, building that huge railroad connecting the coast and highlands, literally trying to bridge that geographical divide and setting up public education. Big stuff.
Yeah, really significant changes. But Alfaro, in the end, proved maybe too liberal even for some in his own party and got pushed out. And he met a really tragic, violent end, dragged from prison and lynched by a mob in Quito in 1912.
Their violent deaths just really underscore the intensity of this political fight between those two camps, the geographical and ideological ones. And even when liberals were technically in charge after Alfaro, real power often stayed with this plutocracy of coastal agricultural and banking interests known as La Argola, or the Ring.
So the influence of those regional elites stayed strong, no matter who was officially president. And then economic crises in the early 20th century just piled on, making the instability even worse, compounding these political divisions.
How did those economic problems play out?
Well, the depression in the early 1920s hit hard. The national currency, the sucre, lost value rapidly, and things got worse when a fungus wiped out a lot of the crucial cacao production. This led to urban unrest, the rise of trade unions, riots, and army massacres. Sources mention hundreds died in riots and shootings in November 1922. Just awful.
A terrible situation. And our sources note this whole turbulent mess led the army to step in back in 1925, saying they wanted to restore national unity.
Yes, and the sources point out something interesting. While this intervention didn't exactly dismantle the power of the old elites, it did set a precedent for the military, seeing itself as maybe a force for reform, not just pure oppression like in some other places in the region.
And this instability just kept going for most of the 20th century. A really striking example is José María Velasco Ibarra, elected president five times between 1934 and 1972, but he was kicked out by the military in all but one of those terms.
Yeah, and think about this statistic from our sources. In just the 10 years between 1930 and 1940, Ecuador had 17 different presidents. 17. And not a single one finished a full term.
Wow. So despite being popular, Velasco's terms were just marked by these sudden policy U-turns, contradictory economic plans, and constant military interventions. What was the overall effect of all that churning?
Well, it made it incredibly difficult for stable political parties to actually develop or for any useful public policies to stick around long enough to work. And our sources really highlight that this constant instability ultimately left Ecuador with a weaker army and a more fragile state compared to its neighbors.
And that fragility became tragically clear on the international stage in July 1941.
Precisely. After a long period of diplomatic arguments and increasing border incidents with Peru, the Peruvian army launched a full-scale invasion.
They seized a lot of the disputed Amazon territory and basically devastated an entire province. Ecuador's forces, described in the sources as poorly trained and equipped, underlining that weakness you just mentioned, were easily beaten. The whole thing was such a disgrace, it caused the overthrow of President Carlos Arroyo del Rio.
And you have to remember the global context here. World War II was raging, and the major powers, like the U.S., were focused on that and wanted Allied unity above all else. So a peace conference was held in Rio de Janeiro in 1942, and Ecuador was essentially forced to give up its claims to a huge chunk of the Amazon region.
Yeah, that remained a really deep wound for Ecuadorians, especially because they felt, probably rightly, that they'd already lost a lot of territory since colonial times.
And Ecuador kept trying to reopen the issue, arguing the 1942 Rio Protocol didn't set precise borders, and so the whole thing was invalid. In 1960, the Ecuadorian government actually formally renounced the Rio Protocol.
So this unresolved issue just simmered for decades and then suddenly boiled over again in 1995 with a very short but intense conflict deep in the Amazon, the Cenepa War. What kicked that off after all those years?
Well, what's fascinating is how the crisis just erupted. At the end of 1994, tensions spiked in this undemarcated border area around the Condor Mountain Range and the headwaters of the Cenepa River.
And the sources detail specific events that started the actual shooting. On the morning of January 26, 1995, an Ecuadorian Special Forces unit launched a surprise attack on a small Peruvian outpost called Base Norte.
Yeah, that was pretty much the start of open fighting. Both countries quickly ordered general mobilization involving something like 140,000 troops in total. The conflict saw intense ground assaults with artillery support and a lot of air activity too, helicopters, ground attack planes like A-37s and Tucanos, even jet bombers like Canberras and fighters like Mirages, Kafirs, and Peruvian Su-22s. Both sides claimed they shot down enemy aircraft throughout the fight.
The sources really detail the fighting at specific places like Tuinza, Cueva de los Tallos, Becer, and Cuangos, mapping out events from late January through the end of February 1995. February 22nd was apparently a particularly bad day for Ecuadorian casualties. They called it Black Wednesday.
The war finally stopped thanks to major international pressure. On February 17, 1995, a peace declaration, the Declaración de Paz de Itamaraty, was signed in Brazil, with the 4 guarantor countries of the old Rio Protocol, the U.S., Brazil, Chile, Argentina present. This confirmed a ceasefire and set up a peacekeeping force, MF, to watch over the separation of troops in key posts. Both sides also promised to start talks on the pending issues.
Then the Montevideo Declaration was signed on February 28, 1995, reiterating the ceasefire, and the sources basically say the Sinapo War was officially over, even though some minor skirmishes continued for a bit.
And crucially, building on that whole resolution process that started after the Sinapo War, the presidents of Peru and Ecuador signed a comprehensive peace agreement in Brasilia in October 1998. This was a landmark treaty that finally drew the line on their shared border, ending decades, really centuries, of territorial disputes and conflicts stretching way back to the Gran Colombia days.
So the border issue finally gets resolved in 1998. What happens moving into the late 20th, early 21st centuries? Did that political instability we talked so much about finally start to fade?
Well, instability persisted, though maybe in different forms. The discovery of oil back in the 70s brought an economic boom, sure, but it also led to heavy borrowing, lots of debt, inflation, all without fundamental structural reforms that would actually help the poor. So new economic challenges just popped up.
A return to elected civilian government in 1979 saw Jaime Roldos Aguilera elected on a reform platform, promising more social equality. But his term ended tragically when he died in a plane crash less than 2 years in 1981.
Yeah, and the 80s and early 90s were just marked by these continued fights between conservative and liberal factions, plus numerous corruption scandals, which just further eroded public trust.
And the 1996 election brought Abdallah Bucaram to power, nicknamed El Loco, the Madman, for his style. Our sources say he promised populist stuff, but instead devalued the currency, which massively increased living costs. What was the reaction?
Huge reaction.
Yeah.
Massive strikes led by trade unions, indigenous protests that just paralyzed the country. Congress ended up declaring him mentally unfit, can you imagine, and ousted him within months. He fled the country.
And there was that really brief period with female presidents right after Bucaram got booted.
Yes, Rosalie Arteaga became president, but only for less than 2 days before Congress replaced her with Fabiana Alarcón. Just another example of that incredibly rapid turnover.
Jamil Mahad, elected in 1998, the same year as the Peru Peace Treaty, he faced a severe economic crisis made worse by El Niño weather and low prices for key exports like oil and shrimp. Inflation just skyrocketed. What did he try to do?
He basically pinned the country's economic survival on dollarization, ditching the national currency, the sucre, and adopting the U.S. dollar.
And how did the country react to that plan?
When Mahad announced dollarization, the country just erupted in protests in January 2000. Protesters, including indigenous groups and even military people led by Colonel Lucio Gutierrez, stormed and took over the legislative palace. A coup d'etat, basically. Mahad was forced out, and Vice President Gustavo Noboa took over, which Congress then ratified.
So Mahad gets ousted over the plan, but Noboa goes ahead with dollarization anyway.
Yep, Noboa implemented dollarization in September 2000. The exchange rate was set at this dramatically inflated 25,000 sucres to the dollar, which caused huge losses for loads of ordinary people. Austerity measures followed to get aid from the IMF and other international lenders, leading to more protests. But, dollarization ultimately did stabilize the economy, even though it came at a massive social cost for many.
Lucio Gutierrez, one of the leaders of that 2000 coup, then gets elected president in 2002. Did he bring stability?
He initially promised a populist agenda, but then turned around and implemented IMF austerity measures, which, surprise, surprise, sparked more protests. And then in 2004, he unconstitutionally dissolved the Supreme Court and appointed new judges, a move that allowed the return of the exiled ex-president Bucaram.
So a move that looked a lot like power consolidation or maybe just plain corruption.
Exactly. That sparked even more protests. The armed forces eventually withdrew their support, and Gutierrez was overthrown in April 2005. Our sources point out this made him the third president kicked out in just 8 years. Just shows that rapid political cycling continued. Vice President Alfredo Palacio took over then.
Then Rafael Correa comes to power in 2006, launching his Citizens' Revolution with distinctly left-wing policies. What were the main features of his time in office?
Well, he oversaw the drafting of a new constitution in 2008. It increased social spending, included protections for indigenous rights and the environment, allowed civil unions. He also went after the oil industry and criticized dollarization, although, interestingly, it stayed in place.
And our sources give kind of different takes on his time in office, right?
They do. While his supporters definitely highlighted reduced poverty and inequality during his years, critics saw him as consolidating power, becoming authoritarian, and often drew comparisons to Venezuela's Hugo Chavez.
His successor, Lenin Moreno, elected in 2017, was initially seen as Correa's protege, but then quickly pivoted away from Correa's policies, moving more towards neoliberal governance.
Yeah, a big shift. And Moreno pushed for a referendum in 2018 that brought back presidential term limits, which basically blocked Correa from running again and totally alienated Correa's supporters. An arrest warrant was later issued for Correa on corruption charges.
And Moreno's own IMF-backed austerity measures, announced in October 2019, especially fuel price hikes, triggered massive protests led by indigenous groups.
Specifically, groups like CONI, the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, were key players. Protesters occupied oil fields, even the National Assembly building, leading to violent clashes. Moreno eventually had to back down and withdraw the austerity decree to get the demonstrations to stop.
And our most recent sources bring us pretty much up to the present day, noting Daniel Noboa winning the presidency in 2023, declaring a state of emergency in January 2024 because of escalating gang violence, and then winning a full term in April 2025.
So, yeah, a continuation of some really challenging dynamics right into today.
So we've taken quite a deep dive into Ecuador's history today, uncovered this really complex tapestry of colonial legacies built on agricultural wealth and forced labor, fierce battles for independence with efforts from both North and South, that ambitious but flawed union in Gran Colombia, and then this relentless cycle of political upheaval and economic challenges.
And we've seen how those persistent border conflicts with Peru, from the devastating 1941 war to the short, sharp Cenepa War in 95, really highlighted the nation's fragility. Conflicts finally resolved, thankfully, through the 1998 Brasilia Peace Treaty.
We've traced how geographical divisions fed into deep political rifts, how external forces constantly shaped Ecuador's destiny, and how that struggle for power among elites often overshadowed any push for stable governance, feeding that cycle of instability.
But despite this really turbulent past, the sources do mention that since the return to democracy in 1979, Ecuador has made strides towards stability. They particularly point to moments of, let's say, apparent institutional consolidation in the 2010s.
Which leaves us with an important question for you, the listener, to think about as you look at Ecuador today. Will these recent periods of seeming institutional strengthening, mentioned in our sources, finally break that long historical pattern of instability that has defined so much of Ecuador's past?
Or will the country continue to grapple with the deep-seated challenges, those historical divisions and pressures that we've spent this time discussing today?
Definitely something to think about.
Thank you for watching Episode 5 of Rise of a Nation, South America. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe for more. Write in the comments what country's rise you would like me to cover next.